grateful to be here. Hello, everybody. If you're lucky enough in life to find what you're good at and what you're interested in, you and I, Kim, were talking about a Japanese model, Ikigai, where you can find what you're good at, what the world needs, what you love, and what ultimately will help you pay your rent. If you're lucky enough to find that cross section, you're lucky in life. So it was a long journey for me to find all of that. I was 27 before I figured out what I wanted to do. And I've found that within the death care industry, there are almost disciplines. There are those who are good at, and perhaps it starts off as a fascination with the corporeal. Most of my colleagues who are embalmers are people who are either, they really want to do that. You have to have a certain fortitude in order to really, and if there are any nurses in the group here, are people who've had the opportunity to really study anatomy. You have to have, there's a certain metal and a certain strength that you have to really look at literally what we are made of. Because it doesn't set us, we're not too far off from the animals that we love. We are animals. And I found that I was okay at that. Maybe I became proficient at best at embalming. But you know, there are, again, different disciplines, and I would characterize myself as front of the house. Do you hear my dog barking upstairs? Is that something you can hear?
It's okay.
So if you're good enough, if you're lucky enough to find which aspect of the death care industry is something at which you'll actually excel, then you're a lucky person. So I am what we would say front of the house as opposed to back of the house. It's engaging with people, distilling information that is sometimes overwhelming given the state of mind of the bereaved. Distilling that down to something that is at a 6th grade level so that people can really understand and not be too overwhelmed with, you know, the painful realities of what we're talking about, and to make really agonizing decisions sometimes at the drop of a hat. I'll say that, Kim, since you and I have last spoken 2 days ago, I have engaged with 3 people I know. One is a high school friend whose son passed away suddenly. And another one of my best friends whose brother passed away suddenly. And then a third friend whose father is in the process of vacating his body, we would say. He's got glioblastoma, which is a very cruel disease. But in the time that you and I have spoken, I've talked to 3 families, 2 of whom have to make just these agonizing decisions about what the right next steps are. And when you have blended families and you have the issue of cremation, a lot of people believe that cremation is, that it stands alone when it is actually the last step in, or not the last step, but it's one of the, it's a step along the way. Cremation, for instance, does not preclude funeralization. And we'll talk about the fact that families can become involved in the process. Last week, I was down at a crematory with a Hindu family. Hindu families, when they are the most observant, have some of the most beautiful, rich, and textured traditions with regards to the cremation process. And when I share with clients of any walk of life, any faith, any ethnic background, some of the things that other families do, they perk up to some degree and say, gosh, I didn't know that I could be the one to actually instigate the cremation. And I'm in the process, I will be in a few hours, of talking to, again, this girlfriend of mine from high school, whose son died suddenly, about whether she wants to be the one to send him out just as she brought him in.
So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we've had 2 cremations in my family, but they have both been just sort of signing the paperwork and then later receiving the remains?
So again, it's my job to let consumers, because people who pick up the phone and call any provider of a death care service, you are indeed a consumer. And I would hope you are a savvy consumer and that you know how to ask the right questions. And if not, then I, as a professional, have a moral imperative to.
Yeah, so let me interrupt my other question with another question. I believe in Illinois, it's the law that a funeral home has to give pricing if you ask for it. Is that correct?
It's so not strict and stringent, but if a family comes in, and this is something they drilled into our heads in mortuary school, the Federal Trade Commission oversees all of the contracts that are drawn up by funeral homes and cremation facilities and cemeteries. And people will oftentimes talk about the package, do you want the package? But they have to be able to justify all of these expenses. And if you're purchasing a package and that package includes flowers, which is quite frankly, for anyone here who has ever been married and had to order flowers, it's almost a subjective endeavor. What does that even mean? Does that mean you have $500 of eucalyptus branches or $500 of roses, which is a smaller, value? So contracts and prices must always be transparent. And as consumers have begun to wise up and ask the questions, they've learned that maybe everything that they're paying for is not something that they need or want. So I personally am a fan of the a la carte menu. And, I like to know where my money is going, and I like to know what all of my options are and the things that don't even cost money. As a cremation provider, families who don't want or don't need to view their loved one's body, or don't want or need to be present during the cremation, may never think that it might be a helpful thing to receive a phone call, or that someone would even think to offer a phone call just before the cremation begins, so that they can pray, they can meditate, they can hold space, they can, and you know this better than anyone, Kim, when someone is taken away from you suddenly, and I presume everyone here knows your story. When someone is taken away from you suddenly, okay. When someone is taken away from you suddenly or otherwise, you are to some degree out of control of the situation. And if there's anything that I can ever do to put someone back in the driver's seat, information is power.
And that's where I come down as a fan of pre-planning when possible. Like with, you reach a certain point in life and the end is closer than the beginning is. And I think, again, like in the case of a traumatic death, right, you're just not in the frame of mind to be asking questions about what is this and how much is this? Like it's such a helpless state. But I think anything that can be done and known and, wishes that can be known ahead of time is really helpful.
All of the bureaucratic issues you need to navigate as well. And that's something that, I hear from so many of my clients. Gosh, there's a man and he is such a delightful person, but he has become a professional caretaker because he performed these services for his mother when she was dying. And he said, oh my gosh, I'm good at this. And now my friend Sylvester is taking care of people at the end of their lives, and he's doing a really
that's great.
So
that's amazing. Okay, so back to being present. What does that mean?
Transparency. And this is another thing, is when people are making these agonizing decisions for themselves, I don't want to ever hurt someone with too much information. So I'll try to caution my families, here's an overview of the cremation process. Here's a folder describing the process with terminologies, and it's a scientific endeavor also. And you can read this when you get home. This is my way of sparing you the details about the cremation process. And if you have questions, make sure you really want the answer. You know, how long does it take? How warm do the machines become? You know, people have these questions about the process. Kim, you were, I think, everything that I showed you, you asked more questions about, even knowing that this was not something that you were going to choose for your father. I don't think you had us take his thumbprint, for instance, which is a sentimental item. But you said, you know, what do people do with thumbprints? And, you know, they do all sorts of things with them.
Yeah, you asked about the thumbprint and some DNA sampling, and having been through a condensed process of cremation with my son a year and a half earlier, I don't think they asked us any of that. It was a sudden and traumatic situation, and we were out of state, and so it was all very like, okay, let's just get this done.
And
so
in
I
this
can get
frame
home.
of mind, when someone is shocked and their knees have buckled and everything has fallen apart and they are no longer the person that they were 5 minutes ago, you know, the things that we mention to families that they will sometimes say, ooh, no, who does that? That 10 years later, they may say, gosh, I wish I did have a lock of his hair. You know,
Yeah.
You try to anticipate what you might want or need in the future. And, you know, this girlfriend of mine whose brother had a horrible, I mean, it took his life, a coronary event 3 days ago. Her own mother passed away when they were 20 years old, so more than 30 years ago. And over the years, as my friend has learned more about what I do, so many times I'm doing jigsaw puzzles with a best friend, and I happen to be on call as well, because you have to have a life in this industry. And maybe I go into the next room and they hear snippets of the conversation. And this girlfriend of mine said, I had no idea I ever could have had some of my mother's cremated remains. I wish my dad had offered that to me.
Oh.
And I said to her, you know what? Probably his funeral service professional didn't offer that to him. So American attitudes about the cremation process have evolved dramatically over the past 30 years for various reasons. A lot of it is population trends and all of that. So,
so back to and maybe this is part of the trend and part of cremation being a more acceptable alternative to many. What do you mean about going and being with the body at the time
being
of
present during the cremation?
Yeah.
So especially over these past 2 years, there are so many people, and especially during the height of our COVID cases, and right now we are in another surge, I promise you this. But 18 months ago, there were people who had been in nursing homes for months who had been incapable of, or their families had been unable to come into the nursing home. And that's, you know, it's traumatic when you aren't allowed, for many people, not everyone, everyone's different, but to not be able to lay your hands on your mother, to not be able to whisper in her ear, to not be able to, and thank God for technology, I'll say. It really did bridge the gap for a lot of people. But during the pandemic, we had more families than ever before who wanted to view their loved one's body while they were in our care, who wanted to be present during the cremation when it occurred. And in the 25 years I've been at this, 20 years of which have been in the cremation industry, I have, of all of the hundreds of families who have opted to be present during the cremation, exactly one has said, this was not the right thing for me to come out here. And it was, in fact, a young mother who lost twins in utero 6 months into her pregnancy. So this is someone whose hormones were, you know, she was, as anyone would imagine, in a great deal of pain, and said, I want to be present, and then came out there and said, this isn't the right thing. So she went out and sat in her car. But we still did what we could to bring her. So most of my families, my clients, will find that it is a positive thing to be present. And Families have the right to be alone in the same room with their loved one's body. Every funeral or crematory has their own set standard as to whether embalming is required. The pandemic, of course, people have tightened up their requirements. Oftentimes we are taking custody of people's bodies from morgues. And before we knew the transmissibleness, if you will, of the coronavirus, just as we were sanitizing our groceries before they came into the home, we were taking steps to, hopefully prevent transmission from someone who didn't die from COVID or with COVID, who actually is still carrying the virus because of morgue environment. So, savvy consumers will ask questions, and your provider will let you know whether or not embalming is required for a viewing. To be present during the cremation, rarely do any of my families ever opt out of instigating the process. And I have seen some of the most beautiful and sometimes amusing things happen at our crematory. But I have seen broken families all stack their hands on top of each other and start the cremation together. I've seen siblings who couldn't stomach each other come together. I've seen a lot of really beautiful and healing things happen at the cremation facility. And I have an anecdote for everything. And
I think the TV show Transparent, I don't know if you ever watched.
Sure.
Yeah,
I handled a family member. Oh gosh, what's her last name? Joey. She wrote Transparent. Her mother is a friend of our family to some degree.
Oh.
And I handled her stepfather, upon whom part of the story was based. So I handled his cremation.
Oh, okay, right. So that they had a scene where they were at the crematorium, and as a family, and then I think it broke into a musical number or something, so it was a little weird. But I think that's the only time I've ever seen anything like that. Again, like so much of death and the death industry, it happens behind a curtain, and until you're in that situation, you don't know possibilities, you don't always know what to ask, and that's why someone who is a good guide like you is so important in the process. There
is, I want to say, a movement, and you know all about this. You've perhaps even done more research than I have, because I'm in the trenches, of death positivity. And that doesn't mean that we run forward we shall sell no wine before it's time, we hope. But, it's accepting that this will happen, and that whatever you do, again, is to promote healing and to do your research in advance, to know what is possible. I had a family this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, and the man passed away. He was an organic farmer in Wisconsin. He died over the border in Illinois, and his family wanted to, rather than, they were very skeptical of the funeral service industry, and there are many reasons to just be, again, a savvy consumer, but they wanted to physically drive him. They wanted to transport his body themselves. They didn't want a licensed funeral director involved. And, a few phone calls, and I was able to confirm that that is legal in the state of Wisconsin. So they drove their loved one's body straight to the cemetery for a burial and a celebration of life. So just know what your options are. And if you don't know, ask. And if you don't ask, you hope that your funeral service professional will lay it all out to you. There's a fine line between maneuvering and manipulating. And you and I could talk all day about the sales and service and the difference between the two. And consumers should never be forced or guilted or meant to think that any of the decisions they make are in any way subpar. I can share with you my professional opinion on death notices in the newspaper, which is that, yes, they are very expensive, but in terms of genealogy, they're worth it. Also in terms of getting ahead of the slippery slope that is social media. I've been sitting at the table with clients, with one man in particular. His wife, who was a known artist, passed away, and he was sitting at my table making arrangements. I had just been to his home 4 hours before to assume care of his wife's body, and he wanted to come in that same day, which I do not always recommend. Sitting at the table saying, "Oh my gosh, someone has already made the announcement on Facebook. Is this not my information to reveal?" So I believe in the power of a death notice. So I try to.
I also want to address that point, because when my older son died, it took almost a full day before we were able to get word to my younger son, and my husband flew down to his college to tell him. And we were holding our breath. Not that many people knew about my older son's death, but I was so worried that somebody, we were really clear with people, do not share this news, because I don't want my son finding out on, Snapchat that his brother died or something like that. And we do, and thankfully it was quiet until everyone in the family was alerted. We do have a question that I want to pass along. Can you describe the process of going into the crematorium for a family? And also, do the remains get returned in an urn, or do families buy that? Oh, that's a rich one. But let's start with the first one about the process of going into the crematorium. Is it just like a regular building? Is it in the middle of nowhere?
It depends on the facility. There are cemeteries who have cremation facilities on their grounds. And what I'm looking for, every once in a while, I'll have a family who, doesn't want to make the drive to the facility that I use the most, because it is in the southwest suburbs. I will say also, it's illegal to have cremation machines on the grounds of any place but a cemetery within the city of Chicago. And I don't want to be a cemetery. I want to be a cremationist. So in order to remain autonomous and to be responsible only for the actions of oneself and the things that we can control, I don't think that I would ever necessarily put a cremation machine on the grounds of a cemetery and say, this is my business now. Because if the cemeterian does something illegal, immoral, awkward, then I'm culpable and I've just lost my life's investment. But the question is, what is it like when a family shows up at the cremation facility? So the way that I'm, as a funeral director who is also to some degree an event coordinator, I have a cheat sheet in my head of all of the items. When someone walks through the door, they're offered a beverage, they're offered to use the restroom. They're reminded to please silence their cellular phones. You don't want someone walking into the room and finally seeing their mother, and then the phone rings. You don't want that to in any way manipulate or impact their emotional experience. There is something about, for many of us, that first look. Gosh, they talk about brides when their husband, or I should say people who are getting married, when their spouse first sees them, the first time you see them presented to you, and it's the same thing. It's that first, last impression, if you will. So I make sure that my family comes in and that they are physically comfortable, that the atmosphere is clean. I have been to cremation facilities that I've rented where perhaps the architecture of the building is gorgeous, but why is everything covered in a layer of cremation dust? Because you don't keep a clean facility. And that's important to me, is that there's some attention to detail. They say God is in the details and so is the devil. You want the environment to be welcoming. You don't want signs of other people having been there. So in a perfect world, the setting is universal and clean. The family walks in, they're invited to relax for a few moments. And of course, COVID, I always have to ask people to sanitize their hands. And we used to take people's temperature, we don't anymore. But that's been another concern recently, is people who've had COVID. And I keep coming back to that because right now it's so intense. If people have been exposed to the virus, sometimes we're doing this cremation 2 weeks later after the family's done a quarantine. But family is welcomed into the waiting room and then walked into what we would call our family room. And my hope, and I'm pretty good at this, is setting an expectation so that people will know what is going to happen. So if any of you, God forbid, need my services, what I'm about to describe to you is something that will actually occur when this does come down. But they're walked into the room, and I try to establish a presence to make sure that if someone does fall out, there are people who have really intense emotional reactions, and that there's someone there to support them. Once I feel that the family has walked into the room and either seen their loved one's body prepared to whatever degree, or there's also a great number of my families who want to be present during the cremation but don't want to view the person's body. That's analogous to a closed casket funeral. But that they've settled into the room with their loved one. And then I kind of demur, and I will have spoken to the family about whether they want me to lead them in prayer, whether they want me to perform any readings, or some of our families have clergy people with them. Family usually has about half an hour alone with the person's body. And then after that half hour, as we approach it, I poke my head in again and say, we're at about 11:30 now. And what I can't say to them is, we have 7 other cremations to perform today. I can say this to you now that none of you are bereaved, but business is business. And it's my job to create a safe environment for you, while also honoring the promises that I've made to all of these other people who are going through the same thing. And in a perfect world, we'll all say, yes, we're all in this together. But quite frankly, you're never supposed to know that there's anyone else who's going, your family is my number one priority. So, your family is then given the opportunity to be as hands-on with the cremation process as you are comfortable. So last week, when this Hindu family, people my age, the children were perhaps a little younger, I'm 51, I believe they were in their late 30s, early 40s. They had a Hindu priest with them, and they did all of these beautiful traditions. And then the son and the daughter were the sole handlers of their father's casket. I didn't touch except to maybe adjust to make sure that nothing was going to fall off of a loading device. But the son and the daughter guided their father's casket out of the family viewing room into the area with the cremation chamber, and they physically hoisted their father's casket from the bier, that's what we call it, it's the casket truck or the bier, onto the loading device. And these were things that they were able to do that were, I know, very important to my family. I think of them as my family that day. And then they actually started the cremation machine. Families are given the opportunity to stay at the facility for the duration of the procedure, but this is something we would have established with them ahead of time. So I can know whether it's after your family leaves to go for a walk in the woods because there's a forest preserve, or to go to lunch, but to know whether it's business as usual that day. Can I then do all the other things that I need to do in order to serve? Yeah. We're multitasking.
So how long is the process? It
depends, quite frankly, on whether it is the first cremation of the day or the last cremation of the day. I will say, and it also depends on the technology, how green, or how efficient, I should say, is the cremation machine. Up until a few years ago, we had a cremation machine that was about 20 years old. That was not problematic. And we're always trying to think, what is the most environmentally efficient way to conduct our business? Because there is, we are accountable to our environment, while staying within EPA requirements and regulations. And sometimes you may have an older cremation machine that isn't as efficient, that doesn't use as many, that uses more fossil fuels than that which is at the height of the height of technology. But to discard this cremation machine, which still functions, is simply a waste. So older machines will take longer. Those that are the height of technology are more efficient. And we have a machine that uses some 65% less fossil fuels than that older machine, which we've since retired.
And do they
take less time?
Sorry, do they get, is there a regulator that comes out and tests them every year to make sure they're meeting EPA requirements?
The EPA is supposed to send people, and I don't know if I don't know exactly. I wish I should have researched this, but during the last presidential administration, the EPA's, all sorts of things were able to happen legally that were very detrimental to the larger environment.
Okay.
And I don't remember how that impacted us. But the length of the time a cremation takes is anywhere from 2.5 to 4 hours. The first cremation of the day will take longer because we're starting with a cool chamber, as opposed to a cremation where all the heat has accumulated over the course of the day. I'll also tell you this: cremation is not a one-step process. What occurs inside the cremation chamber is just the first part of the procedure. The cremationist sweeps out the contents of the chamber, and we would characterize these contents as bony fragments. I can put an oak casket, which we don't like to do, but I can cremate an oak casket with a person's body inside of that. And it'll take longer because that's an oak casket as opposed to a cardboard container. We have to use some sort of, there's no other way we can get someone's body into a cremation chamber without sliding some sort of rigid box. So it's required by law and also logistics. But after we sweep out that cremation chamber, everything about us is vaporized. And tell me if I'm going off topic here, but everything about us is vaporized.
Not off topic, but I also want to mention there's like a tag that stays with the person, right? Because you can't recognize one person's remains.
Some crematories, and I know that Isaac, there's a tag that accompanies the person's body that is not able to be cremated, which means it's probably made of titanium. Titanium does not cremate. And I can tell you from all of the hip replacements that I disposed. Almost anything that's inside of us that's metal it's probably titanium because it survives the cremation process. So the tag, some cremationists use a tag, other cremationists use a barcode scanning procedure. But there should be some checks and balances system to make sure that, quite frankly, God forbid something happens to that cremationist, or they go off duty and another cremationist comes on to relieve them. It has to be seamless and everything has to be accurate. There has to be some accountability.
Okay, and question that came in, and we also will get back to the part about the urns and stuff, but a couple questions have come in that I think are flowing with where our conversation's at. One is, what happens to those hip replacements, metal plates? Pacemakers have to be disabled and removed, right?
Pacemakers are removed before the process, also defibrillators. And remember, some people have pacemakers up here because Parkinson's is affected by brain stimulation. So a pacemaker is not just a coronary device, but they must be removed from the person's body. Quite frankly, there's a battery in a pacemaker, which causes an explosion. And no one wants that. It's also dangerous to my colleagues who are performing the cremation. Pacemakers can be recycled, not within the United States of America. However, there is, through the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, there is a project called Project My Heart, Your Heart, which does recycle pacemakers. And they are trying to prove the efficacy of this rather than wasting this device.
Yeah.
So someone in a developing nation who wouldn't have a crack at life at all can receive your mother's pacemaker.
Yeah.
That you don't even know is possible. Every once in a while, I'll have a family who will be mistrustful of that, and they'll say, I don't want the pacemaker donated. And then it is medical waste. The fact that it's through the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, gives it, some street credibility, I should say. So,
okay, so what about the plates and the
medical waste? There are companies out there who can take titanium, which isn't normally recyclable, will take titanium and indeed turn it into ignot is the word that they use for the little capsules that into which they're reduced. We recycle everything that we can. Sometimes it's impossible. And I mentioned I have an anecdote for everything. Those of you who are in Chicago who know Oz Park down in Lincoln Park. Oz Park is a Lincoln Park, city of Chicago park. And there are sculptures inspired by the Wizard of Oz, which are all made from recycled automobile parts. I had the distinct honor of handling the cremation of a man named John Carney, who was the artist who created these sculptures, and his son, who is also a visual artist who uses recycled items, wanted his father's hip replacement, which is like a canister with a big ball bearing, returned to him. And I presume he turned that into a piece of art.
Okay, so question, and Judy kind of mentioned this in the comments. Her father, I think it was her father, her mother, they had done the water cremation, which we're going to talk about in a minute, right? And she said the guy sold it, her guy sold it and donated it to charity. So I guess because you're the only person I know who I can ask about this. So what happens at titanium? Is there a value to that? And should someone be getting a credit? Should a family be getting a credit for the titanium? Or
I would say no. And I often hear about the gold teeth. And I learned this from the Field Museum exhibit on gold, that in the history of mankind, the amount of gold that has ever been discovered, uncovered, recovered will fill, if you imagine an 18-wheeler cargo truck, will fill 48 of those. That's not actually that much gold.
Yeah.
And so people consider gold is very expensive. The value of a golden filling or a golden cap, we don't go there.
Okay.
Families who ask, though, the answer is, if you would like that golden tooth, you'll have to hire a dentist to come make the extraction. It's not something that an embalmer is we're not skilled in. It's you want a professional doing that.
Yeah.
Of the thousands and thousands of families with whom I've met, I'm going to say about a dozen, maybe 15 families have said, what about that gold tooth? And I've said, well, we can hire a dentist. And they said, oh no, because they think the reality is the tooth needs to be extracted. So. Yeah.
Okay, so can we talk about aquamation and then get back to the way when the ashes are presented and the many options.
Actually, Kim, can I go back and just finish the cremation process?
Oh, yeah.
We sweep out the cremation chamber, and then these bony fragments are processed. Well, after they've been placed into a container and labeled with the name of the decedent as well as the barcode, that's how we do it, placed into the morgue so they can cool down so we can work with them. And then these bony fragments are processed in a machine to this finer, powdery, gravelly consistency that we recognize as cremated remains. And I do have some cremated remains here that I can show if anyone wants to see them.
Okay, and before she does that, let me know through a message or the comments if that is something you don't want to see. But I know a lot of people are here because they're curious about different aspects of cremation.
They're the cremated remains of my beautiful late dog. So for what that's worth, they belong to me. They're mine. So resomation, right? Alkaline hydrolysis, flameless cremation, water cremation. It is, I will say this, we are in the Midwest and we are somewhat, I don't want to say behind the coasts, but we're behind the coast. There's a reason that it's in the great state of Washington, the Pacific Northwest, that what is it that you're going to interview about? Why can't I? That composting, human composting has started. We wouldn't be able to support that industry here in the Midwest just yet. So it's something that we in the Midwest, Resomation, we're still catching up with the fact that this is even a possibility. So
right, I know we did that with my father's body, and you said that was your first time. Yeah. Is there only one person or machine or outfit in Illinois that does this?
There's one provider of whom I am aware.
Okay.
And when I talked to him on the phone, he was a delightful person, but I could see that he doesn't work with the public directly, I don't believe. He only works with funeral homes. It's just so interesting. And, I want to say different strokes for different folks. It's not something that I would necessarily choose for myself or my father, but I was grateful for the opportunity to get a bird's eye view into why someone would choose it and to build the bridge to make it happen. And, we were talking about Jewish traditions and the Jewish approach to cremation. And I will say that even when I worked for a Jewish funeral home 23, 4 years ago, we saw cremations. And I serve so many Jewish families right now. But we talked about resomation as an alternative to cremation when a family wants cremated remains, but doesn't want this horrific reminder of that which occurred during the Holocaust. So there are, do you want to describe resomation?
Do I?
Do you want to give?
Well, my understanding is that it's basically like an alkaline bath, so kind of. Oh, what was that horrible show? I couldn't watch it. With the guy who made the meth, the crystal meth.
Breaking
Bad, yes. Isn't that what they did on Breaking Bad? I think they dissolved bodies.
I never watched it. I should have. I didn't. But
yeah. So I'm not deep into the technicalities of it. My understanding is just that it's a greener process, and so it's interesting hearing you talk about some newer cremation machines that are much more energy efficient. That's interesting to know about. But I actually learned about it from Judy in one of these talks that we had. Judy is one of our guests today. And it sounded like a greener process, and that literally the end product besides the bones is just flushed down the drain, which might sound awful until you think about an embalming and what's going down the drain in an embalming process versus what's coming out of this process. So
I have laughed a little bit about the big picture. And once you actually start trying to calculate your carbon footprint, and, maybe because I'm just not smart enough to get my mind around all of the science, but I feel that our Earth is going to be, will be rejuvenated ultimately after it's destroyed. So, all we can control is and are ourselves. And then you hope that your neighbor is doing the right thing too. But it's going to take a mass revolution for people to really undo the damage that people have done. So
I want to go back to the Jewish element, because my family's Jewish, and I know several of the guests here today are Jewish as well, because it is more widely accepted now, and it of course depends on which I don't want to say genre of Judaism, whether you belong to, Reform or Conservative or Orthodox. It is becoming more widely accepted, especially in Reform and Reconstructionist elements. But there aren't yet a whole lot of rituals around it. So it's yes, it's accepted, but we don't really have a ritual process for it. So, which, as someone who identifies as or belongs to a Reconstructionist congregation, I like the freedom and creativity to be able to come up with something.
Right.
And it also, usually in the Jewish religion, you know, we get bodies in the ground right away. And so this is, for better or worse, it's a slower process. You can have a memorial. I mean, we had Isaac's memorial well before we received his ashes. But even that was like a week, and that felt like, I mean, it was also a really obviously awful and crazy week, but it felt like such a long time until we got to the memorial, just because our cultural standards are like 3 days, you know, 2 or 3 days. And so, yeah, so I mean, I think there's opportunities for creating new rituals around cremation.
So with the cremation process, there's a world of bureaucracy over which your funeral director has no control. The physician needs to sign the death certificate, and he or she has legally 3 days to do this, but sometimes they blow that out of the water. Or sometimes I've been trying to call the doctor's office for 2 days and no one's been answering, and then finally someone calls back and says, oh, he's out of town. So, you know, there's this world of bureaucracy. And then there are the checks and balances system at the level of the city and the county and the state. It's having the death certificate reviewed. I can't tell you how many death certificates end up bounced back to me because of an insufficient cause of death. You can't say that someone had sepsis. You have to say whether the sepsis was traumatic or non-traumatic, meaning, was it because the person was stabbed and then an infection? So there are these kind of nuances that we know how to navigate the system. We can't make it go any faster. But in terms of Judaism and the efficiency, we used to be able to say to families, do you want a 24-hour rush on that? Charging more money, of course. Do you want to pay more money for this to go faster? We used to call it a 24-hour rush. We can't call it that anymore because we weren't able to meet that requirement or that request. So, you know, there are ways of doing what you can to honor tradition. You know, some of my colleagues, and I grew up in Rogers Park, you know, half of my friends are Jewish. And, you know, I used to work for a Jewish funeral home. I learned so much there. And I'm a Chicagoan, and, you know, I'm mostly educated, and I can recognize a Jewish name when I see one, or I can feel people out. And sometimes they're Italian. But the point is, a skilled funeral director would look at the person, look at the family, and say, what do I know about the traditions within this faith and culture? And should I at least, you have like, again, a moral imperative to say, do you want a Shiva candle? You know, do you want Kriya ribbons? Do you even know what they are? Here, let's Google it together. You know, there are human beings behind the disposition of a dead human body. That's where my service begins, is that there is a problem. And that problem, unfortunately, will in swift time become a public nuisance unless something happens. And these are the terminologies that we were taught in mortuary school. So I'm not being flippant when I say public nuisance. You know, it starts with the disposition of a human body, but then you've got human beings as well. Judaism and cremation, right? So Shiva candle, Kriya ribbon, copies of Kaddish, building the bridge between a family who didn't think that they wanted a rabbi with the right and perfect rabbi. One of my favorite things about Judaism is that it's almost an intellectual approach to connecting with the divine. You ask a lot of questions, and it's almost downright Buddhist. You know, do you get the answer? That's where faith and intellect and your heart and your mind all come together. So there are just a lot of beautiful things. And my clients, I have a lot of interfaith clients. I have a lot of Jewish families who will say, we are Jewish. And my dad never went to temple. He never went to shul. He didn't And then I'll say again, do you want a Shiva candle? And they'll say, I do. Or his sister will really appreciate that. So, people are fascinating. And there are many paths to one ultimate truth. And if you're lucky enough to be on one of those paths, to whatever degree, whether you're observant, whether you keep kosher, no matter what you do, you light candles, no matter what your faith, I'm not going to say I'm personally envious, because that would be revealing a lot about myself, but I'm happy for people who have faith and can find some comfort in that action. If there's a way to honor God in your everyday life, then your eyes are really on the prize. When it comes, though, to what I'm trying to help my families do, it's to, again, as we started in the beginning, minimally we must follow the law. But if there's anything that I can do to help you, and as well as a professional, I'm also an observer, but to make some sort of connection with the divine, then I guess to some degree I've succeeded. When your heart breaks, when it opens to the possibility. And I'm having feelings right now talking about this, because that's like, we're so temporary. Life is so fragile and so short. And, I mentioned I'm 51. I still feel 24, yet I'm not, right? I used to have this sign up in my office until my boss made me take it down that said, inside every older woman is a younger woman wondering what the hell happened. My clients all thought it was hysterical.
Right.
And
yeah, all of us in our 50s and 60s feel like we're, younger inside, but then you talk to someone in their 20s and, we're still ancient to them.
I've had to adopt to a whole new language. I have a number of trans friends, and I've learned how much my language is antiquated. And, I don't want to be the old fuddy-duddy.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to catch up.
So speaking of catching up and sticking with trends and things, I think talking about first how the remains get returned to the family in general, and then Brooke will tell us about some of these, but if you Google, what can I do with cremated remains? Your mind will just be like, what?
So cremated remains need to go into something. And that something has to have 6 sides to it. It's got to be a vessel. Oh, unless it's shaped like a Grecian vase, of course. So it's got to have a lid. It should be rigid. Unless it's a biodegradable vessel that's designed to be placed into a body of water to biodegrade. It needs to have some sort of plastic liner, a plastic bag inside, waterproof, I should say, bag inside. There are a lot of funny scenes in movies that are not funny in real life, of cremains scatterings gone awry. People drop an urn, it crashes, a cat walks into the room. Ha ha, that's funny. It is not funny in real life. You need to have a plastic bag inside of that. And a lot of the biodegradable urns that I've worked with actually have a liner that appears to be made out of plastic, but it's actually a gelatin product tied with a piece of string, so it's still biodegradable. But it must be rigid, it must have a lid, and depending on who your provider is, some cremationists will not perform the procedure until that vessel is at the crematory, because they don't want bags of cremated remains sitting around unidentified. That's just asking for, it's a nightmare in the works. And cremation, the service exists at almost every price point. I know funeral homes who charge $4,500 for a cremation. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have businesses that are designed to serve the impoverished. And as I've said, we the people do a lousy job of taking care of each other in our lives. Until we have national health care, we can't talk about national death care. So there's not much for consumers. There are people who don't have 2 dimes to rub together, and all of a sudden they've got to do a cremation. It's their son, right? So, there's something at every price point. My goal is no matter where I'm working, for whom I'm working, you're still getting the Brooke Benjamin treatment, right? You're still being asked all the questions. You're still, you're educated as well by the process. So, what was your question? I've talked.
So they're returned in some containers.
Minimally, it is a rigid container that we will characterize as a temporary container. It's either made of cardboard or it's made of plastic. And, funeral providers want to sell urns because that's how they pay their bills, right? There's no nonprofit funeral anything in the state of Illinois except for veterans cemeteries, Catholic cemeteries, a couple Jewish cemeteries, and Bohemian National Cemetery by Northeastern Illinois University at Foster and Pulaski. That's a nonprofit. But there are no nonprofit funeral providers. Everyone is seeking to make a profit, to have a good quality of life, to ultimately think of retirement or selling their business and hitting, it's a very competitive industry as well. But dialing back from that, cremated remains need to go into something. And when you're choosing whether it's a casket or an urn, to me, here's what you're taking into consideration in no order of importance: aesthetics, affordability, and the practical use of the vessel. If cremated remains are going in the earth at a cemetery, there are laws at the state level, and then every cemetery can set their own requirement. So of all of the cemeteries, except for one who I can name later, and I love them, of all of the cemeteries with whom I've worked in the state of Illinois, if you show up with an urn that is made out of, and my dog's cremated remains are in this urn. She was a Jack Russell, so these are her colors. But if you show up with something that is made by a ceramicist, or if my husband passes away, God forbid, tomorrow, this is his humidor. This is his urn. I bought this for him. But if I show up at a cemetery with something that's made out of glass, metal, wood, ceramic, biodegradable, it can't go directly in the earth. It's got to go into a vault because it will rust, rot, corrode, and collapse under the weight of earth. Earth is very heavy. The same is true of caskets. Caskets can't go into the earth directly. Now, in Judaism, you can bypass purchasing a vault, which is a protective container, and I have my own ideas about this, with a porous container, which is a cement grave box.
Oh, because it's supposed to be in contact with the earth. Yeah.
So there are ways of workarounds so that the grave doesn't collapse. You get this Legend of Sleepy Hollow effect, right, where the headstones list. But you can still honor your traditions.
There is, I believe, like out in Vernon Hills or something, a green cemetery?
It's in Cary, Illinois.
Okay.
It's called Wind Ridge, and it's a hybrid cemetery. They do have a natural section, and I've had a number of services out there, and boy, is it beautiful. It's hauntingly beautiful. When you see a person, we're by definition anthropomorphic. You see the outline of the person's body in a shroud, lowered on a piece of cardboard because you needed something rigid, with the straps, the lowering device, into the grave. No casket, no embalming. It's more kosher than the most kosher Jewish burial, right? No earrings even. No clothing, no snaps, no zippers. no casket, no vault, no grave liner, no supportive device, lowered into the grave, and then the earth goes directly on top of the person's body, and the grave is closed, and it's just really, we would call that a green burial. Now you have to be certified green in order to use the word green, and I don't know if they're certified green by the Green Burial Council, but it is by definition a green disposition. And it's a natural walk that they have. It's a natural section, but they also have traditional graves. So it's a hybrid cemetery. And then there's another one down in Springfield. I haven't done business with them.
Okay.
But times in the Midwest. You go out to Wyoming, California, lots of green cemeteries.
Yeah. Okay. So back to so someone has the ashes or urns, you're going to use your husband's humidor, and then there are all these services that will do things with the ashes and incorporate them into artwork and jewelry, and which, I think on the one level that might be a lovely way to remember someone, but then I go to a lot of estate sales and I just picture, this paperweight with, Uncle George's remains being on it, like nobody's going to be the wiser, but yeah. I just feel like that as it goes through generations, that could be kind of a process.
That I say to families, at some point in your lifetime or your children's lifetime, at some point something has to happen, right? And if you have cremated remains in your house, where are they exactly? If there's a fire, once you get all the living creatures out of your home, you've got to run and grab your mother's urn. So these are all considerations. There's the burden of being a human being, the burden of leftovers, the burden of what do you do with. They can become a burden unless you have a plan.
Yeah. But as you might recall, my parents, when they did their pre-planning, they chose these tiny little vases, and so there were some leftover ashes that someone in the family will scatter at a future point, but then the important people have this very small urn that they chose for us. And then do you want to talk about one of the things? So my son's ashes he died in January of 2020, the day before the first then COVID case was discovered in the US. And needless to say, all of our memorial plans and scattering his ashes got interrupted because of COVID. We had plans to go out of state. And so we literally had this box, they were mailed to us, and this box that the US Postal Service finds it necessary. I don't know if you can talk about why this is, because remains are inert, but they have it's stamped on every side with this big stamp, cremated remains. And that box just sat for the longest time because the memorial never happened and we couldn't figure out how we were going to scatter them or what we were going to do with their remains. And then Brooke told us about this fabulous option that you can talk about now. And do you know why the Postal Service has to label remains like that?
Well, to drive home I imagine, it's precious cargo, to drive home to their employees that this is not a box of books. And I think
that makes sense.
That this is something that you should rise to your highest self as a mail carrier, right? And I've got a fantastic crew of mail carriers who come to my own home, and I love them because they'll tell me if a pair of tights is sitting outside in a box. They don't care what it is. They want to let me know it's there, but it's not always that case. To drive home to people that this is more than what you're doing is very important work, mail carrier.
Yeah. That's true. It's just hard to look at, sitting on a shelf for all this.
I had one of the more intense and beautiful conversations with you and your husband. And I will remember you for the rest of my life, Kim. And I never met your son, but I will remember him for the rest of my life.
Thank you.
And his name was Isaac. And we don't want to get too far off track, but this is year 2. This month is the anniversary of his ascension. So, and that's a Catholic term, but I mean, I'm certain he's part of the cosmos. And, you know, so I've been thinking a lot about you, but,
Thank you.
So
Isaac's next step. Tell us about Isaac's next adventure.
Next adventure is that you have selected for his cremated remains to be solidified. And we have shipped Isaac's cremated remains to a lab in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they are being superheated beyond what we're able to do in our cremation chambers. Superheated. The calcium phosphate, you know, we are elements, right? We're carbon-based life forms. And when people say to me they're going to take cremated remains and put them under a rose bush, I'm like, it doesn't work like that. The pH is too high. So the calcium phosphate is denatured. His cremated remains are being superheated. And then a ceramicist is taking the end results of your beloved son's cremated remains and turning them into, I have a little pouch here, if everyone can see, what are called parting stones, parting like goodbye. So these are cremated remains that have been superheated and then turned by an artist into parting stones. And you can Google this, everyone. A young man came into my office about 3.5 years ago, and he presented this newer technology to us. And I went, oh my God. It just gives you a different way of engaging with cremated remains. Can I show my dog?
Yeah.
Cremated remains?
Yeah, there didn't seem to be any objection.
So my dog, her name was Chicken, and I wasn't able to fully love another human being outside of my family and some dear friends until I knew what it meant to take care of a pet, to be a halfway decent custodian of the heart of an animal, right? So these are Chicken's cremated remains. Powdery, gravelly consistency in a bag with a zip tie in an urn that I had a friend make for me because it looked like her. She was Jack Russells have been circus dogs, and this reminds me of a big top. So that's Chicken. But her, to have these cremated remains then turn from this, if anyone here has ever scattered cremated remains, they are buoyant in the air. If I were to take a teaspoon, and drop it from this height onto a surface, I would still, into a surface 6 inches, I'd still have a dust cloud. So you have to see how cremated remains behave when you are doing a loose scattering. Cremated remains that have been solidified into parting stones, number one, the calcium phosphate is not going to leach out because it's been completely denatured. And you can take these stones, you can get onto an airplane, and you don't have to claim them as cremated remains. They don't resemble narcotics. They don't resemble explosives. I can carry one of these in my pocket, and I've always got someone with or near me, and disposing of these, it's just a lot easier. So, one of my friends, it's a mutual friend of ours, Kim, actually, her mother and her father both passed away within years of each other. And I went to her home, and we commingled the cremated remains of her mother and her father, and then we split them in half, and half were turned into parting stones. And my girlfriend and her sister went to Florence, went to Italy, and scattered these parting stones hither and yon, which is, I'm going to imagine, as much a part of the healing as a poetic endeavor. So, and I can't remember what they're doing with the other half of cremated remains. Maybe they're not there yet. I don't remember. Forgive me. Laura, are you on here? I don't think she's on here, but she knew about this event today. Okay. So, parting stones. What I will say is, if you do this through a funeral director, it is less expensive. If you do this through parting stones directly, it is slightly more expensive because the Parting Stones and every other provider of all of these new and interesting ways of disposing of cremated remains, engaging with them, they rely on funeral homes to market their stuff. And, I don't have a horse in the race right now. I have nothing to gain from any decisions people make. So I'm not saying I don't care what you do, but just make sure it's legal and ethical and that you know what you're getting yourself into. There's also a technology, we're in cremated remains, and I know we're at the end of our time soon, but quickly, there's something called Life Gem. You can Google this, where the carbon in cremated remains, under extreme changes of temperature and pressure, culture a gemstone. And the American Association of Gemologists calls them diamonds because they are diamonds based upon carbon. So I had a client last year, her husband passed away, and they were a lovely and delightful family. Very wealthy, which is irrelevant, except that Life Gem is very expensive. It's a very preclusive event for endeavor for most of my clients, but she's got 2 canary yellow diamonds in her ears. Her husband, over the course of their relationship, bought her diamond studs in every color of the rainbow except yellow. And now she has $40,000 later, diamonds in her ears that are made from the carbon that was her husband's body. Something for everyone.
I'm just putting a couple things in the comments. Oh, a ballpark figure for the parting stones, it was like 500-ish for humans and less for pets?
If you do parting stones through Parting Stones themselves, I want to say it's like $695, not including shipping and handling. And if you do Parting Stones through someone like me, it's about $100 less, and we do include shipping and handling.
And you can do it for pets as well.
Yes, you can do it for pets. It's less expensive because it's a lesser volume.
And in terms of the volume, it's basically what you put in is what you get out. So if you have 7 pounds of ashes, you get 7 pounds of stones.
You receive 7 pounds of parting stones, and that can mean as many, it could be up to 25 or 35 parting stones. Also, you have to keep an open mind about the end result. I've had parting stones, and I don't, what we see according to the light of my laptop computer, this is stone colored. What does that mean? It's bone colored because they're cremated remains. That's what bones are. That's what cremated remains are, by the way. It's our armature. It's our skeletal system. But I have had parting stones come, and this was shocking to me, the color of coffee beans. Literally the color of coffee beans. And the young man, his name is Justin, is still trying to deduce what chemically is happening during this process that they should, I say to people, just like any piece of art, you keep an open mind about the end result because the item is to some degree creating itself. And sometimes they have kind of a sage tinge to them.
And will they eventually biodegrade, or would it be like a natural stone? It'll biodegrade, but it could take, hundreds or thousands of years.
I believe the latter is true.
Okay.
They're not biodegradable immediately.
There was also a question that had popped up that I missed earlier about before the grinding process, what are entire bones coming out of the machine, or what?
It's not like it's a perfect outline of a human skeleton once the door goes up. The process needs to be encouraged. It needs to be almost not curated, but it needs to be, so someone is in there making sure with implements that the cremation is happening thoroughly, that 100% of us. And so they are bony fragments that are swept out of the cremation chamber with my dog's about to start barking, another's walking by, but swept out of the cremation chamber with a fine bristle brush. We can't get in there with a vacuum cleaner. There's always going to be some scant commingling, but as I'll say, if I have dandruff today, I'm commingling with the world. but scant traces of commingling is inevitable. Darling. So it is a process. And did I answer the question? It's not a perfect outline of a skeleton, no.
And Matt asked what I was going to, similar to what I was going to say to you. Two things. One is, Janice mentioned there's a ceremony in Japan where the bony remains are picked up and chopsticks are passed from person to person before going into the receptacle. And I think those are very large urns, aren't they?
I don't know that, but what I do know is every once in a while, I'll have a family who will ask us to process the cremated remains differently so that they can do this beautiful ceremonial action. And it does involve members of the family, I think sitting around the table and filling the urn with chopsticks. And you do need larger, you can't do that with powder. You do need larger bits.
Okay, and so in the interest of time, going back to Matt, which I'm going to break into a two-piece question. One is, how can people follow up with you? Can I share your email address, or do you want to put something in the comments?
My cellular phone. You can find me on Facebook. My image is of a little girl and a little boy, and a hand holding some fiddlehead ferns. So Brooke Benjamin is my name. I can give you my phone number is 773-370-2959. You can find me through Kim. I'm generally pretty easy to find. Right now I am, I guess you would say I've gone independent. I've gone rogue. I've gone independent because I've been at this for 25 years, and at some point you think you want to hang your own shingle. And I'm kind of kicking around my options right now. I was with a cremation outfit for 20 years, and they were some of the best 20 years of my life. I'm really grateful for everything. But at some point you say, what do you want your future to look like? And when you hit a glass ceiling, I take my clients very, very seriously. I'm protective of my personal brand, and I want to do things the way that I want to do them, the way that I think that they should be done. And, the first question when I want to know who this person was, and that's not always been the focus when you work for a cremation outfit, is who was the person. So quickly, it's the care and the handling of someone's body in the immediate and the shortly thereafter. It's the care and the handling of someone's cremated remains. It's the celebration of life. It is the bureaucracy navigating that. I've got a guy or a gal for everything, right? But if you don't think that you need an attorney, sometimes you do. And then what we call aftercare, which is making sure that you, my client, that you're able to begin the process of healing, and that you know what you need to do next. And that if you're in danger, and it's a small percentage of my family is about whom I am worried that they will never recover, because we have to, right? We say we have to learn how to live, even though everything's different. So that's how I feel I'm holistically helping people. So
thank you. I think that shows. It is 4:30, so if people want to drop off, they can. And Brooke, if you have time for one more minute, which is sort of like the part 2 of Matt's question, I want to thank everyone for being with us. Part 2 of Matt's question, as I interpreted it, is any advice for someone who suddenly or unexpectedly finds the need for your services?
Yeah. So the first concern, suddenly and unexpectedly, means, of course, that you didn't see this coming. The first question or the first concern is, for me, is the safety of the people who are suddenly bereaved. And then that they've had enough sleep and that they've been drinking water, taking care of themselves, and then the whereabouts of their loved ones' human remains. When someone dies in a hospital, and laws vary from state to state, and procedures vary, but when someone dies inpatient in a hospital, their body automatically goes to the morgue in the hospital after the family has had a chance to visit, if they want that. The good thing about this is it buys you some time. You can get some sleep that night and then make your phone calls. When someone is on the floor of their bathroom or in their bed or in a nursing home or in a hospice facility, once that person has passed away, there's a sense of urgency. Nursing homes, you've got 4 hours before Elvis has to leave the building. They need that room for the next patient. And oftentimes you've got a roommate, and it's not climate controlled to the extent that it needs to be for preservation. So, you know, we were talking about pre-planning, pre-arranging, talk to your families about what you want, etc. But it's the safety of the survivors, and it's the location of the person's body. Every once in a while, I will have a family who is completely prearranged. All of these arrangements were made years ago, and their survivors didn't know about it or forgot about it, or the name of this company is so similar to the name of this company, or the funeral director with whom they prearranged is no longer at this outfit. What the heck do we do? And they've got to make some quick decisions. So what I want to say is, and I can't say this enough, communicate. Just have the bare bones of the conversation. But, you know, because sometimes indeed at 2:30 in the morning, you've got to choose a provider and you want to be a savvy consumer about it. So.
Thank you. That is, I think that's the perfect ending, because that's what these discussions are about breaking the taboos and opening up the discussion so that we can have them, and then we can have them with our friends and our family and our dear ones, so that we know what well, you never know what you're getting into, but you're a little more prepared for it.
There's so many resources out there. Let's Imagine. What's it? Let's Reimagine?
Let'sreimagine.org. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. And you are considered a funeral director and a celebrant, meaning like you will lead memorials.
I'm a licensed funeral director. I've been in the industry for 25 years. I went to journalism school before that. But a licensed funeral director. I'm licensed to embalm, although I don't have the skills anymore. I have the license, but you don't want me embalming. And I'm not sure that I have the metal for it anymore either. But I can certainly attend to people's physical remains. I do a lot of removals and a lot of adjusting people's bodies while they're in a casket, but I don't embalm anymore. I do have the license, but yeah, licensed funeral director. And a celebrant, I suppose anyone could call themselves a celebrant. Celebrants marry and bury people. But that's the part of this gig, this multifaceted gig, that I'm going to say I most enjoy, is researching people's lives and presenting or preparing a memorial service that doesn't sound like everyone else's. You know, how many times you've been someplace and you know the clergy person is dialing it in, or that they didn't have an opportunity to do anything other than that which is, you know, other than read a script. But we all have these lives, and, you know, I don't want my friend whose brother passed away early the other morning. I don't want his story to be reduced to what a raw deal he got, that at the age of 56, he died suddenly. There's so much more than that. You know, Isaac has a whole story to him. Every single one of us has a story, and not everyone is kind. And that's always been interesting, is making a memorial service happen when the person who's passed away has deeply hurt their families or has made it difficult for family members to love them. And, you know, I don't believe in opening wounds, but I also don't believe in, you know, we all have lives, and it's how we cope with that which we've been given that makes us who we are as human beings to ourselves, in terms of our own self-image, and to each other. And, we all try to do the best that we can. And people evolve. My favorite funerals are when people weren't good people who became good people, or people who've claimed their sobriety, for instance, people who've evolved, because those people are way smarter than those of us who haven't really had to change ourselves. So those are the easiest lives to celebrate, when there's something to celebrate. I mean, there's always something to celebrate.
There's always something to celebrate. Sure. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you everyone who joined in. I hope it was interesting and informative, and I hope you'll join in for future discussions that I'm going to be hosting later in the year. They're always different topics, different people, different wisdom and life experiences to share. And I thank you, Brooke, for sharing yours with us today.
It's my honor.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.